In Vedic astrology, the planetary relationships, or how the planets treat one another, is probably the most important concept to really grasp and understand to know whether a planet is functioning healthily or unhealthily. And it comes from the idea that planets are treating one another as either a friend, as neutral to the other planet, or treating the other planet as an enemy. And the planets are interacting through conjunctions, through the aspects, and through whether they're in a friend, neutral, enemies sign placement. And you can think about it as if you were going to your friend's house, if there are planets in that sign, or you were close to a friend, or a friend was looking at you. You feel better and you can operate better, as opposed if your enemy's looking at you, or you're in your enemy's house or your enemy's territory. And these are called the Lajjitaadi Avasthas, which just essentially means the states of the planets. And you can think of each planet as having an agenda, and each force within you is trying to do something. It's operating in a certain way. And so the friends, enemies, or neutrals are going to be affecting how that force within you, how well that agenda is operating within you. And if you'd like to know the full extent of your Lajjitaadi Avasthas, you can go to my website at jmvedic.com. They are a fundamental part of the written report that I do. So in this video, we're talking about the enemies of the moon. And it's unique to the moon that the moon actually doesn't treat any other planet as an enemy, which means that no other planet is going to cause the moon to feel starved or ashamed. And those are the two negative Lajjitaadi Avasthas, the two negative sensations that a planet gets from having an enemy being in conjunct an enemy, or having an aspect of an enemy, or being in the enemy sign. And the only exception is Saturn, and Saturn's unique because any planet that is conjunct Saturn, that planet will feel starved. So we're going to discuss Saturn and the moon in a little bit. And keep in mind that other planets do treat the moon as an enemy. And those planets are Mercury, Venus, and Saturn. So the moon is going to affect Mercury, Venus, and Saturn in a negative way, those aspects of your consciousness. And we'll discuss how the moon negatively affects those planets when we get to that video. But the fact and the idea that the moon treats no other planet as an enemy really shows the adaptability of the moon. When our ego consciousness, our moon, feels threatened by another person or a situation, it's important to keep in mind how much of that threat is part of your imagination. We talk about how the moon is what we imagine life to be, and our interpretation of our perception of the world. So some threats are very real, but since our ego, our moon, has no inherent enemies, there is always the possibility to be adapting to any adverse situation. Albert Camus, who was a French existentialist author, he wrote, one of his most famous books is called L'étranger, The Stranger. And it's actually a very beautiful critique of existentialism. Existentialism is the idea that life has no meaning, essentially. And the book is about a maladaptive young man who sees that there's no purpose in life. And there's a really great line in the book, and it struck me when I read it, and it was very important to me. And what he says is that my mother always taught me two things: that you can always find something to be happy about, and you can get used to anything. So the statement from the mother is a very lunar statement. And of course, it's the mother who says it, and the mother is our number one feminine influence in our life. And the attitude of the young man in the novel, it's very bleak. He's very existentialist. He's wandering through life. He gets in trouble with the law, and he has no purpose. And you can interpret the mother's phrase. You can take the most extreme situation. Can you get used to anything? And can you find something to be happy about in anything? Well, say you're being tortured. Can you get used to the torture? Can you find something to be happy about in the torture? So you can really kind of take that phrase and put it into a context of, wow, I don't know how I could get used to anything. And it's not actually a good thing to be getting used to anything, but we'll get to that in a minute. But it's a very reactionary posture to the world. You can get used to anything, you can find something to be happy about. And the moon is pure receptivity. The moon is never acting. But the moon's power is our reaction, our perception. And that's what the statement is all about. What is our reaction to whatever situation we're in life? So there's something deeply self-empowering about these statements from the mother. and about the lunar consciousness, because when you're not looking, so instead of looking at the world and the potential problems that can be happening, or that there's harm or that there's threats, these inevitable things that happen, we're not always in a perfect, pristine environment. And instead of looking at the world like that and seeing that there's, say, nothing you can do about the situation, taking these statements that there's always something you can do, even if you're in prison or even if you're being tortured, say those really intense extreme examples. And we'll talk about how it's maladaptive to adapt to unhealthy situations. You have to adapt yourself out of them. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's all about the self-empowerment of your attitude that the mother's statements in the book are about. And there's always going to be some kind of hostility in your life, and there's always going to be something challenging you. And the moon's ability to face that challenge is how is your attitude shifting, or what is your attitude in that context, or when you're perceiving the world, what are you doing about it? And it begins in your mind state. It begins with your attitude. So the self-empowerment aspect of the lunar consciousness, what it comes down to is recognizing the power of your mind and the power of your attitude in every single moment of your life and in every single situation. That there's a freedom and intrinsic power that you have because of what your subjective perspective is inherently. And when you think about it, our subjective perception it's a battleground in these days. All of the influences coming towards us, it's all meant to convince us of certain things. It's meant to give our mind messages and to influence our attitude, our way of looking at the world. Because our subjective perception is so malleable, it can change. It's always changing. So it's a hot zone, it's a battle zone for every person. But within that, you have to realize that when your mental state is healthy, that is where your source of power is. And think about the book 1984. Controlling the mind is the most important aspect of the military dictatorship in the book. And because it's the ultimate form of power over an individual, when you control what they think. And when the protagonist, Winston, is being tortured, the military general who's in charge of the torture, his goal, which he ultimately succeeds in doing, is to convince him to change his mind, to say that 2 + 2 is equal to 5. Because it's not enough for the military dictatorship to simply control your body, put you in jail, to disappear you, to kill. Their ultimate goal is to change everyone's attitude, to create falsehoods. And basically their source of power comes from the mind control. And that really reveals so much about if someone's trying to have power over you, they need to get inside of your thinking to really truly control you. And that shows the power of your own mind. And it's all to say that your subjective perception on the world is something that no one can take from you, that you always have a choice to think what you think. 1984 is extremely bleak because it has this endpoint where Winston is convinced of the falsehoods. He loses control over his own mind because of the torture and because of the drugs. But it shows you that it's something that we always have a choice to control. Our attitude is it's the ultimate source of our power. So the unhealthy lunar consciousness, it's essentially not taking these two phrases that the mother says in the book, that you can get used to anything and there's always something to be happy about. If you say that there's nothing that you can find to be happy about, you're essentially living a life of discontent and fatalism, of the existentialism, and that no matter what you do and no matter what you're perceiving in the world, it doesn't make any difference, and that there's no purpose. If you think something is, there's nothing you can be happy about, you're saying, I have no power to do anything to change anything, which is untrue. And that's unhealthy way of thinking. It's the unhealthy ego, the unhealthy moon. And if you say that you can't get used to a situation, you're immediately disempowering yourself, because the fact is that you can become used to any situation. So the lunar consciousness is self-empowering because it's this part of us that's creating intentions with our imagination. And that is what is helping us get out of the rough patches in life. So now let me talk about the situation of the common example of abuse, whether you should be getting used to a situation of abuse. And the answer is no. So you can interpret the phrase of the mother in, oh, well, you can get used to anything. So what if someone's abusing you? Well, let me explain, because I was just mentioning the power of your imagination to get through the rough patches in life. So when in a situation of abuse, saying you can get used to anything, including abuse, technically you can, but that is an unhealthy form of the lunar consciousness. What you want to be doing is take the first part, finding something to be happy about, imagining yourself in a more optimal situation, and using the lunar imagination to adapt yourself into a better situation eventually. So the phrase that, oh, I can get used to this, it's a phrase we use in English when we say, oh, this is great, this is a great situation in very optimal circumstances. But nobody should say, oh, I can get used to this when it's a negative situation. That's a sign of that you are not able to put yourself in a better position to get what you truly, to get your needs met. And one of the key things of getting your needs met, everyone needs to feel loved, everyone needs to feel appreciated. So you're not, if you're not putting yourself eventually into a situation where you're feeling appreciated and loved, and you're receiving good things into your life, you're being maladaptive. You're not putting yourself into a better situation, and you're instead being complacent and saying, oh, I can get used to this crappy situation. No, the moon is the part of us that helps us to change, to put ourselves into a better situation. So that is a hallmark of the unhealthy moon. It will adapt to unhealthy situations, like justifying an abuser. And here's the key point. There are infinite ways to imagine yourself out of a situation where you're not getting your essential needs met. And in this case of not receiving love and affection from an abuser, there are so many ways that you can work to change your situation, but the unhealthy moon is not doing that. It's not imagining, using the moon's ability for imagination to reposition itself into a better and more optimal situation. And it also goes with the attitude of finding something to be happy about in any situation, in any kind of depressing circumstance. If you're able to find something to be glad about, if you can find a positive, even in the most dire of circumstances, what you're doing is you're activating the power of intention within yourself. And gradually your mind will continue to gravitate towards those positives. And your perception of the world improves because you're focusing in on the positives. And what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of good things to be happy about, and gradually your attitude is shifting, and then more positive things are going to be attracted to you because your mind is attracted to them. So that positive outlook is the fundamental power of the moon's attitude, the fundamental power of the moon's ability for intention to imagine something better, to find good things to be happy about, and to train your mind in order to gravitate towards those things, and gradually those things will increase in your life. And of course, with everything in life, it's about finding a balance, and you don't want to obviously no one wants to get stuck in a bad situation, and we have to adapt ourselves to get out of them. And the idea that the moon has no enemies says that there is no situation in life that we can't learn something from, and that there's no situation in our experience of life that we cannot use to elevate our consciousness. And it's those most difficult situations that train us the quickest, that make us learn the fastest, and they have the deepest and most longest lasting effects. So as we discussed in the second moon video, the attitude that everything in life is throwing at you is a way for you to help you evolve and to help you grow. And that's the opposite of victim consciousness. So this self-empowerment of the moon is saying that there's nothing that I can't handle, and there's always something that I can look at to be happy about, and to gradually improve and adapt and change my situation when you find yourself in bad situations in life. Everyone can get used to living the easy life, But eventually even that becomes draining. You're not meant to have no challenges. You're not meant to be in a utopic surroundings at all times. So our moon is this part of us that trains our attitude to become more powerful, to really shift our focus into the positives, and to be able to say, I can get through this. I have the inner resources to get me through this. And I have the power to adapt myself out of it. And so those are all aspects of a healthy lunar consciousness, and the healthy way of looking at that phrase, that you can find something to be happy about and in any situation, and you can get used to anything. Any situation you find yourself in, you can find your way in order to adapt to it, and then to eventually imagine yourself out of it if it's not a situation you want to be in. So now I'm going to talk about Saturn in the context of being conjunct the moon, which will make the moon feel starved. And again, Saturn is the only planet that if it's conjunct any other planet, it's going to starve that planet, or make that planet feel like it's missing something, it's needing something, and it's hard for that planet to feel the fulfillment that each planet wants to feel. And you don't have to have Saturn conjunct your moon to still feel these effects. These effects are the unhealthy lunar consciousness and how the unhealthy lunar consciousness operates. And one of them is the tendencies that come from the alignment of Saturn and the moon conjunct. So the moon is our individual perception that is completely different from every other person in the world. And so when Saturn is hanging around the moon, conjunct the moon, that subjective perception becomes heavily influenced by the characteristics of Saturn, which are limitations, the thoughts of what could go wrong, the inevitable difficulties and burdens of life, and the psychological complex of feeling inadequate or feeling restricted by the problems of life, the inevitable limitations of life. So Moon-Saturn conjunctions will often result in depressive tendencies and a person who feels like they have it's a lot more difficult in order to get around a situation or to get yourself out of a situation. And the person feels that they're not in touch with their internal resource to adapt and change themselves and change their surroundings, because there's this cold and restrictive influence of Saturn being put onto your subjective perception. So it makes a person much slower to react and to be able to morph and change. They feel like they can get stuck a lot easier. Again, it's not just if you have this configuration in your chart. This is a sign of the unhealthy moon, when you're much more lethargic when it comes to, this situation sucks, so I don't have the energy to get myself out of it. The energetic healthy moon is quick to get itself out of those situations. But Saturn, the slowness of Saturn, makes a person feel like, it's not even worth trying to get myself out of this. It's not worth trying to look at the situation better. It's inevitably going to be bad, so I'm just going to have to deal with it and feel low and feel that, I'm just going to deal with it, but in an unhealthy sense of not looking at the positives and not looking at, I have to work myself and adapt myself out of this. So if the moon is brighter or on its way to being full when you were born, these people have a greater ability to get rid of those sensations, those feelings of inadequacy, and the person is a bit quicker in their ability to see the growth potential of an adverse situation. As I was saying, that all situations help us grow. The moon within us, it's teaching us how we grow into create a stronger and more healthy self-perception and self-image towards the world. So in general, you'll see people with a brighter moon in their chart be able to work themselves out of the situation a bit quicker. But if the moon is waning and in very dark moon and close to the new moon, you'll see these people get stuck in that kind of negative pattern of thinking, and they feel a lot more prone to become emotionally troubled about the inevitable difficulties of life, because life has inevitable difficulties. It's whether we're getting stuck in them and focusing too much on them. So a moon that is more waning and it's unhealthy in your consciousness, it's going to take more time to get yourself out of that habit of mental the mental rumination on problems and over focusing on the things that you can't change about yourself or the things you can't change about your circumstances. So it's actually very similar to how Saturn negatively affects the sun. And when that happens, and when a person has a negative solar consciousness, their confidence goes down, and their ability to project their soul's passion and the fire the soul has to build a stable life around oneself, the agenda of the solar consciousness. When Saturn is affecting the moon, it's very similar because it is creating the unhealthy lunar consciousness creates this internal emotional turmoil and the sensation that there's something intrinsically wrong with oneself. So when Saturn affects the sun, it creates a low sense of confidence, and it slows down the ability to express your soul's energy, essentially, what your soul desires most to express of itself. And with the moon, it causes this sensation that there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with the way I think. I'm defective in a certain way, or that there's a flaw in me. There's a flaw in my way of looking at the world, and therefore I'm not worthy to receive good things. I'm not worthy to receive love into my life because of that flaw that I have. Those are signals of an unhealthy lunar consciousness. That because of that there's something defective about me, I'm not worthy to receive. So in order to adapt oneself out of that attitude and that mindset, the person needs to realize that their individual perception needs to be adjusted. It's that simple. The moon is our perception of things. It's our self-image. So the ego feels emotions as a weak point in their life, that somehow the way that they feel about the world is something, it's a weakness to them. Saturn is when it's conjunct the moon, or when a person has unhealthy lunar consciousness, the emotions, they don't feel empowered by their ability for intuition, their ability to understand what's happening to them, what's happening in their inner emotional world. So emotions feel like a weak point in their life. They don't understand what they feel. And so for these people to get yourself and adapt yourself out of that unhealthy state of mind, that unhealthy ego, it's so key to not wallow and ruminate on one's negative mindset. And I find the best way to do this, to not be ruminating on the negativity, is to do what the moon does best. And what the moon does best is to be social and to be expressive about what one is feeling, expressive towards other people, to work on reading other people and to get out of your own emotional mind state. So oftentimes this means talking with your friends or trusted friends, talking with family, seeing a counselor or therapist or astrologer who can help you see the things to be happy about, to see how you have more power than you realize that you have in the power of your attitude and your mindset, and to concentrate on your strengths. And so when Saturn, the force of limitation within us, is affecting the moon, is negatively affecting the moon's ability for imagination, you have that. The problem is the person feels limited in their ability to imagine themselves out of their poor mindset. And that is, one of the hallmarks of depression. You're stuck in negative thinking. And so to get oneself out of that, it's about training the person. And I said, being social and talking about these things with other people so they can show you a different perspective, their perspective on you, and to show you that your mind and your attitude is incredibly powerful. And when you change your attitude towards the world around you, reality starts to morph and change in a better way. Your attitude creates this outlook. And when you change your attitude, you change your life. And so this requires training your attitude and training yourself to be seeing the world from a more positive perspective, so that you can start to see more positive things. And then eventually your external world starts to feel different, starts to look different, because your internal self is seeing things differently. And there are so many people that talk about that fact, is that when you change your mind, when you change your attitude, you change your life. It's an internal process, and it's the moon part of us, our ego, that is the source of that power to change our life. And as I'm saying, you don't have to have Saturn conjunct the moon to have the tendencies of this problem. And I'm very much adamant about speaking about the negative effects of the types of therapy, which is so common in contemporary psychotherapy and counseling, of the idea of ruminating on the problems and to not offer a solution and overly affirming the problems. So I counter that with the need for solution-based therapy, and why, of course, it's important to discover the problem, discover the source of what's going on in our consciousness, in our world, within, say, the planets, and discovering one planet that could be malfunctioning. Yeah, we have to find out what's the source of the problem, but then we have to explore the solutions, and that is planet specific. So when it comes to depression, it can't just be about the problem-centered therapy, which is what most of therapy is today. We have to work ourselves out of it, and we have to explore the solutions. And the one thing that the unhealthy lunar consciousness doesn't need to be doing is to be rehashing traumas, to be constantly thinking about the things that are going wrong, to just let the patient or the client just sit there and talk about problems all day. And what this does is it creates a self-identity, or it cements the self-identity that is based in or deeply informed by the faults, what is happening wrong, and not working to heal the sensation that we're faulty or there's something wrong with us. We have to really imagine ourselves into a better mind state, and that begins with our attitude. So there's problem-centered therapy, and then there's solution-centered therapy. So with the unhealthy lunar consciousness, it really starts on not over rehashing way too much the sensation that you're surrounded by problems, or that there are threats constantly in your world, and that there's nothing you can do to adapt to them. And there's also this idea of toxic positivity, which is toxic only when you're ignoring the problem. So the moon has the power to help you imagine yourself out of a bad mindset, which is the most common cause of depression, in unhealthy rumination on problems and weaknesses and faults and inevitable burdens, all of these things that Saturn does. And overworking those things out in your mind is what causes depression most of the time. But depression and severe depression are caused by many different things. It's not just a one and done. But the moon is often and usually involved in depressive cases, people with depression. Though it's not the only factor, we have to look at the moon when it comes to analyzing a person's depression, because it's about how they see the world, what their self-identity is based on from what they're perceiving the world to be as. So essentially what's happening in our lunar consciousness, when it becomes unhealthy, it's constantly being pulled down instead of looking out and seeing what can be better, to find something to be happy about no matter what situation you're in. And the negative self-identity gets formed, and it makes it harder and harder to pull oneself out when you're in the habit of constantly ruminating. And as I said, toxic positivity, it's the opposite. Toxic positivity is completely ignoring the problem. It's toxic because you're not getting at the source of the problem. You're just pretending like everything is okay. So that's not what a healthy lunar consciousness does. It identifies the problem and it recognizes something that's going wrong. It's not just ignoring the problem. So I want to make that clear as well, because that's a real situation as well. That's just being ignorant of the reality and perceiving that nothing's wrong when there are deep-seated issues that need to be addressed. So as I said, the tendencies of the Moon-Saturn conjunction, you don't have to have that in your chart to be expressing these tendencies. And what they are, it's the unhealthy way that the moon, the lunar consciousness, is expressing itself. And it can happen to nearly anybody. In this day and age, over-focusing on problems, and especially in the therapeutic setting, it's generating deeper unhealthy lunar consciousness. The ego and the self-identity are just creating deeper habits of ruminating on what your perceived problem is, instead of looking outwards and imagining new solutions.